Okay, welcome back to the second entity relationship design exercise. We talked about the beer database earlier. This time we're going to do a slightly more complicated scenario, that to do with book publishing. So the book publishing database, as with the beer database, has a bunch of requirements. I'll talk about some of them now, and we'll talk about more of them later on as we get further into the design. Okay, so the kind of things that we need to talk about with a book publishing database is obviously books and publishers, as in publishing houses, not publishers like Rupert Murdoch, and authors, and in this case we're also going to talk about editors, who are the people that take the author's work and fix up all the semicolons and so on and knock it into shape for publication. So, editors and authors are both people and have similar characteristics, but they're involved in different kinds of relationships. And as soon as you have something like that in the scenario, that suggests that what you want is subclasses. So we're going to start with a person relationship, or I'll write it as people, since I've tended to write all of these things with plural. And there are different kinds of people. So there are author kind of people, and there are editor kinds of people. Okay, so the authors and editors are subclasses of people, and to represent subclasses in the ER model, we typically use a little circle and associate the subclasses to the parent class, something like this. So what this says basically is authors and editors are both types of people. One thing with subclasses, you need to indicate whether the subclasses are disjoint or they can overlap. In other words, can someone be both an author and an editor, or are author type people quite different to editor type people? And back in the requirements it said that the skill sets of an author is quite different to the skill sets of an editor. So the implication there was that they would be disjoint, which we indicate by putting a D in the circle. The other thing that we need to worry about with subclasses are whether every person is a member of one or other of the subclasses. And in this case, we're not interested in random Joe Public in the database. We only want people who are either authors or editors, which we'll indicate by putting a double line or a thick line from the superclass to the subclass indicator. So what this is essentially saying at the moment is that we have people in our database who are either authors or editors, but not both. All right, so what properties do people have? Well, in fact, before we get on to people, what properties do authors and editors have? Well, in fact, we're going to find that they don't have any properties really that distinguish them. All of the properties they have, or all of the attributes, are inherited from the parent class. So all authors have the same characteristics as editors. And those characteristics are, for example, a tax file number. And remember that in Australia, tax file numbers are unique, so we can conveniently use them as primary keys. What other information are we interested in about people? Well, we're probably interested in their name. And in the context of writing stuff, or in the context of books, authors have a real name, and they often have a name that they use when they're writing books. And in fact, they may have several different so-called pen names that they use while they're authoring. The other things that we might be interested in with people are where they live in case we need to contact them. So we might also have an address as an attribute of person. So this diagram here, what it basically tells us is that everyone, whether they're an author or an editor, has a name, address, and a tax file number that describes them. Okay, so that covers all of the stuff about people. On the first requirements page, there was also some references to relationships, such as authors write books and editors edit books. So now it's time to take a look at the second page of requirements and start working on the rest of the schema. Okay, so from that second page of requirements, we can see that there are books in a publishing database. That's kind of obvious that we'd have books, and the other kinds of things in the system are publishers. All right, so what kind of information do we have about books? Well, certainly books, any book is going to have a title. Books are uniquely identified by an ISBN, and I probably should have been consistent with my colour scheme, so attributes are actually in blue. So any book is going to have an ISBN, something that uniquely identifies a particular edition of a book. So that's the other thing that we're interested in with books, is that, you know, is it the first edition, the second edition, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so the ISBN will be something that uniquely identifies a particular edition of a particular book. Publishers have a name like Springer or Harper or Collins or whatever. That would probably be unique, but all publishers also have to have an Australian business number in the Australian context, and that's for tax purposes, and that certainly uniquely identifies a business, so it's going to uniquely identify the publisher. And publishers are probably located at a particular place, so we can have, an address for each publisher. Okay, so I think that's everything that was on the requirements. Okay, so some relationships. Authors write books, so there's clearly a relationship between authors and books, which we could probably call write quite nicely. Now, I said before that authors have pen names, and they may have different pen names depending on the particular book, and so we could, as we did with the cost of a beer in particular bars, we might associate the author's pen name with the relationship between that author and the book that they wrote. So when this author wrote this book, they used this particular pen name. As far as authorship goes, in the initial requirements, it said that a book may have 0 authors. It may be published anonymously. So a book won't necessarily have a relationship to any authors. However, an author, it would be a bit strange if they wouldn't really be an author if they hadn't written a book. So there'd be a total participation constraint there. Well, there should be. Let's see. So one of the other requirements was that books have an editor, and every book has one unique editor. We assume that once an editor starts editing a book, they don't vanish, and we have to have another one. So books are edited by particular editors. So the relationship there could be something like edited by. Alright, so what about the relationship here? I said that each book has one particular editor. So this is going to be a 1-to-n relationship, which we indicate on our ER diagrams by having an arrow in the direction. So a book is associated to, at most, one editor, and every book has to have an editor. So this part of the relationship here is a total participation constraint. So we write that with an ugly looking double line or a thick line. Notice that I don't have a thick line here, which means there may be editors who are sitting around idle and haven't edited any particular book at this stage. Alright, so books are published by publishers. So there's a relationship between books and publishers, and that's going to be too big to fit in here, so I'll just write published by. So every book has to be published by one publisher. And if we really wanted to, we can insist on total participation constraint there, because you're not much of a publisher if you're not publishing any books. All right, getting there. There should be a relationship between editors and publishers. If we go back and look at the requirements, it says that a particular editor works for one publisher. So we don't have editors who spread their workload around. So there's a relationship between editors and the publishers that they work for. And I just said that editors work for one publisher for their whole editorial life, and so we can represent that by that arrow there. I guess if there's an editor who's not editing any books, then maybe he's not working, or he or she's not working for a publisher, so we could leave that as not total participation. A publisher who didn't have any editors wouldn't be publishing any books, so we could insist that every publisher must have at least one editor working for them. And with all of that, I think we're pretty much satisfied all of the requirements in the spec. So there's our publisher schema.